Well, g'day and welcome to the Northern Illawarra Uniting Church sermon for this week, August 11th. We are BULLI's chapel on a hill, making way for people to come back home to God and make room for help and hope. We're glad to have you with us, and we're continuing our little series on the story of Jonah from the Old Testament. And today we get to the guts of the story, literally. Jonah in the belly of the whale. The story is found in Jonah chapter 1, verse 11 through chapter 2, verse 10. And it's a longer story, so I'm going to just summarize it here, and I will read a piece specifically from the story at the end. If you recall from last week, Jonah, fleeing from God's call, encounters a storm at sea. And the sailors discover that it is Jonah's fault. The storm happens because he's fleeing from God. And so they try and row back to land, but they cannot do it. And eventually, after much persuasion, they relent and throw Jonah into the sea, sacrificing him, and the storm stops. They are saved. But for Jonah, the trouble is only beginning. He is swallowed by a great fish and spends 3 days inside its belly. And it's there that he begins to pray, and we've actually recorded his prayer. He calls out to God for help and how much he needs him. God hears his prayer, and the fish vomits, we're told. Vomits Jonah out onto the beach. So crazy story, huh? A storm sent by God, a sacrifice that stops the storm, a song from the belly of a whale. It is hard to believe. And I think we can say that this story is a myth, too ridiculous to be believed if we read it as history. But here's the thing. Strange myths can be true. Not in themselves, but true in the way that a sign is true. They point to the truth. You read a myth like you read a sign. You don't focus on the sign itself. You focus on what the sign is pointing to. And look, this is not just a Bible thing. We tell ourselves myths all the time, but we don't always ask if the myths are pointing to the truth. We may not believe the myth of Jonah and the whale, but I can actually think just off the top of my head a few myths that I've heard that people have tended to believe. Let me just give you 3 examples of myths that I've heard that maybe have been believed. So the first one is historical and political. About 25 years ago, there was a terrible disaster and 2 great towers were destroyed. And the great rulers of that land discovered that who had caused this terrible tragedy. And they called this group of people the axis of evil. Do you remember that phrase? The axis of evil. And this axis of evil was responsible for all the terrible things that have been done. This axis of evil was all the bad people, all the foreigners who lived over there. And so a great army was formed and went out to destroy this group of people, and the world was made completely safe from terror. At least that's the way the myth was told to me about 25 years ago. The myth told me that all the evil was out there, and you could point to the bad people because they look different and they pray different. It was a myth that I heard. Here's another myth, and this one's been going around for a while, at least since the 80s, and it's inspired many people and still does today. It came from the Greek goddess of victory. Do you know her name? It's Nike. And she looked out on the world and saw many weak and flabby people, lazy she called them. So Nike blessed the world with magic shoes that she gave to anybody who wanted them. And all you had to do was work hard, no excuses, no shirking, and you had to act. And if you used these shoes, you would become a winner, fit, focused, and victorious. And if you didn't, well, then you were a failure. And Nike had those 3 magic words that this myth tells over and over again. Just do it. And maybe you've heard that myth as well. It tells me that hard work and endurance will solve every problem. One final myth. This one is one that I've made up myself. And I'm not sure if anyone else has a similar myth, but I find this one to be very powerful, and I retell it to myself all the time. There once was a little boy called Josh, and he was very polite and never disappointed anybody. And because he worked so hard and never disappointed anybody and looked as though he had everything under control, he was rewarded with a good life and everything went his way and nothing bad ever really happened. Now that one is definitely a myth, but I've told it to myself many times. I'm telling myself this is how you get the blessed life. Now, as strange as it is, compared to the Jonah myth with the whale and the swallowing of the whale, these 3 myths are told as though they're sensible, as though they're true, but do they point to the truth? And just because a myth seems sensible, just because a myth is believed by many people, doesn't mean that they are true. In fact, some myths, and I think the three that I just told you, actually are dangerous lies. And Jonah, despite how strange his story is, could actually speak the truth. You see, the Jonah myth introduces us to some foreigners as well, the sailors who faced the storm. And these sailors were foreigners in every way. They knew nothing of Jonah's God. They were Gentiles at best, pagans at worst. They worshipped every other god and gave wicked sacrifices. They did not worship the true God of Israel. They were foreigners in every way. And Jonah, who was a member of God's chosen people, he was running away from all the wicked pagans. But do you notice what happened in the story? In this myth, the pagan sailors are not evil. They, in fact, go to great lengths to try and save Jonah, even though Jonah had caused all these problems. They do not want to sacrifice him, though Jonah thought the pagans sacrificed people all the time. This myth, this strange ancient myth, is a sign that points to shattering Jonah's worldview and perhaps ours, by telling us that goodness can be found even in our enemies. A strange myth, but maybe a deeper truth. But the myth, the story gets stranger. These sailors try to row their way out of danger. They try to escape by their own efforts, but it doesn't work. They row as hard as they can. They strain at the oars, desperate to do the right thing, but they fail because the storm was too much for them. Eventually, they have to give up and throw Jonah into the sea. And this myth points to an uncomfortable truth, the truth that the goddess Nike will not tell us, that sometimes we do all we can. And sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes we persevere and we fail. Sometimes you cannot row or work yourself out of a problem. And this myth points to the reality, the truth of human failure. Again, this strange myth points to a deeper truth than all these other reasonable, well-funded myths. A stranger myth, but a deeper truth. And then finally, we get to the heart of the story. Jonah is thrown into the sea. His sacrifice calms the storm. The fish swallows him, and Jonah is taken down to the bottom of the ocean, where he spends 3 miserable days in the belly of the whale. But in this strange story, this is where the breakthrough happens. It's in the belly of the whale, lurking at the bottom of the ocean, that Jonah finally stops running. He turns and faces himself and finds God. Let me read to you just a little bit of the prayer that Jonah prays in the belly of the whale. I'll put it up on the screen. Jonah prays, "You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountain. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever." It's a song of grief, of admission. It's a song of death. This moment of honesty after everything has gone wrong is actually not the end of Jonah's story. I mean, scientifically, historically, it should be. He was swallowed by a fish. But it's not the end. This myth is pointing to a deeper truth, that this moment that should be the end is actually the moment of recovery, of redemption, of blessing. His prayer continues. He says, "You brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you." How strange a prayer in the belly of a fish sounds. But this myth, this strange, bizarre myth, this story that we dismiss, points to a deeper truth, a better truth than all my little myths of self-improvement. You see, it points to the truth that blessing is not found in pretending that I am better than I am. The path to life is not self-improvement, certainly not in the facade of my own skill. The path to life is always and ever through the deep, through facing our grief, facing our need, facing our failure, maybe from a religious point of view, facing our sin. Self-improvement and good intentions may lead us to the best that humanity has to offer, but ultimately they are myths. It is facing the deep, our need and our failure, that leads us to God. And that's why Jonah, as strange a story as it is the truest myth there is. You know, this view of Jonah is not unique. Did you know, actually, in the New Testament, that the only prophet that Jesus himself compared himself to was the prophet Jonah? There was one time when people asked Jesus for a sign, and he told them that the only sign that they would receive from him was the sign of Jonah. When Jesus described his own life and calling, he talked about the sign of Jonah. And what did he mean? What's the sign of Jonah? The sign of Jonah is the journey to the belly of the whale for 3 days. The sign of Jesus is the journey down from the cross into the grave for 3 days, only to be raised up. And this sign of Jonah points to a God who is great, larger than the sea, greater than all the myths of this world. And it points to people like you and me who are very small, and in the grand scheme of things is very fragile. And this sign points to the reality of our struggle as human beings. And this sign points to a God who loves us and holds us, not just when we are doing well and doing right, but when we have fallen into the bottom of the well. And this God who raised Jonah up, who raised Jesus up, and raises us up as well. You see, the cross of Christ, the heart of the Christian faith, is a sign that offers hope to the very least. It's why faith flourishes in the hardest of places, in slavery, in addiction, in grief, in loss. In the face of all these things, the myths of this world, the great political myths that we tell ourselves, the great advertising myths we tell ourselves, the little lies that we tell ourselves, all these myths fail in the face of such depths. They are lies. Only the sign of Jonah, the sign of Jesus, faces the truth and points the way out. And there is nothing mythical about that. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.